A pleasant good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this side event as part of the World Food Day celebrations on understanding disaster risk management dimensions in the agriculture sector of the Caribbean. My name is Martina Duncan. I am the Natural Resources Officer for the FAO at the Sub-Regional Office in the Caribbean. I am one of your moderators this afternoon, and I also have one of my colleagues supporting, Roberto Sandoval, and you will hear from him shortly. As we know, the Caribbean has been faced with a lot of natural disasters in the past few years, and in addition to that, we have this year a non-climate related hazard in COVID-19 pandemic that has been creating a lot of havoc in the region and affecting many sectors, including the agriculture sector. So this afternoon, we're going to hear a little bit about what is happening in the region in terms of the agriculture sector response to disasters, climate and non-climate related. It also covers the fisheries sector as well. We'll be getting perspectives from the national level as well as from the regional level. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Anyone who has questions, you can type them on the YouTube channel. That's where the questions will come in. After the presenters speak, we will respond to the questions following the presentations. I will now hand over to my colleague Roberto Sandoval to take us through the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So we have six presentations lined up for this afternoon, and we would like to start with something that's related to understanding the impacts of COVID-19. So we are fortunate to have with us our colleague from Guyana, who will be sharing with us the results of a COVID-19 impacts assessment that was carried out in the country, focusing on analyzing the impacts of COVID-19 on the agriculture livelihoods in Guyana, as well as reflections on current and future agriculture disaster risk management work in the country. So please allow me to welcome Ms. Natasha Birgit Dionarin, the Director of Planning of the Ministry of Agriculture in Guyana. So Ms. Natasha, please, you have the floor and you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Roberto. 1 second. Okay, so the COVID-19 pandemic has triggered an unprecedented global health and economic crisis, and it has brought worrying effects to human life, production, the global supply chain, and trade, and led to major disruptions in all the sectors of the economy. Today, I'm just here to give a short presentation on understanding the COVID-19 impacts on agricultural livelihood in Guyana and reflections on the current and future agriculture disaster risk management work. My presentation is based on findings of the CARICOM, a regional assessment done by CARICOM and FAO. And this assessment is on the COVID-19 impacts on food security. So my presentation will just give a brief overview of agriculture in Guyana, the COVID-19 situation, the approach the assessment took, the main findings, government response, and a little bit on needs and recommendations. Agriculture contributes about 20% to Guyana's gross domestic product. In terms of employment, about 17% of the share of total employment is from agriculture, forestry, and fishing, according to the 2017 labor force survey. In terms of trade, agriculture contributes about 22.5% to Guyana's total export earnings, which is about $352.6 million US, with rice taking the lead. For our national budget, agriculture on average is about 6% of the national budget estimates. In Guyana, we produce about 59% of our food for consumption. This is according to the 2015 FAO report. So a little bit details of the different subsectors. Crop contributes the majority to agriculture GDP with about 59%, other crops leading with rice and sugar. Livestock is about 18% and fisheries about 11.6%. So the map of Guyana here would give you just to give you an idea of agriculture. So regions 2, 3, 4, 5, and the upper part of 6. This is the main populated area and agriculture area in our country. So the last row would show the drainage and irrigation as part of a key agriculture activity. Drainage and irrigation is a very important program for the Ministry of Agriculture and the country as a whole, because this coastline here, where our majority of people are, is below sea level and is very vulnerable to flooding. So most of our approaches to agriculture would be on flood risk management and disaster-related risk management. A little bit about the COVID-19 situation in Guyana. We recorded the first case of COVID-19 on March 11. Today, there's about 4,325 cases of COVID-19, with daily new cases ranging from 7 to 79 cases per day. This survey was done in the assessment that this presentation is on was done between July and August of this year. And you'll see that period. Since then, we have had increases in our COVID-19 cases. In terms of a regional breakdown, majority of the cases are in Region 4, which is the most populated region of our country, and that's where we are located in Georgetown. So regions 1, 7, 9, and 3 have also some of the higher cases of COVID-19. In terms of the assessment, it's, like I said, it's a joint CARICOM FEO assessment done in July to August 2020. So the assessment had 4 surveys. In total, we had about 1,111 respondents, so it's 741 from farmers and fishers, 166 from key informant interviews of extension officers, and we tried to have all the extension officers with the Ministry of Agriculture responding to this survey. 88 input vendors responded and 116 food traders. The survey utilized an online tool, ArcGIS Survey 1 to 3, and this was complemented with phone calls and paper questionnaires. Convenience sampling was utilized and snowballing to select these respondents. The main findings of this assessment, so the main respondents for crops were rice farmers, vegetable farmers, and roots and tubers farmers. In terms of livestock, poultry, cattle, sheep, and goat, and for fisheries, it was marine and aquaculture, but majority of the responses came from crops and livestock farmers. One of the major findings is that 70%, there was a reduction of about 70% in income of our farmers. 36% said there's a significant decline, and this is about 20 to 50% less in 2020 when compared to 2019. While 35 said there was a marginal decline of between 5 to 20%. Crop farmers stated they had 75 respondents said they had difficulties with production, the crop farmers, while 60 for livestock. Fisheries, most of the difficulty was in marketing of fish due to restrictions of COVID-19 and decline in prices. How did they cope with these? The respondents stated that they purchased low quality planting material, reduced the planting area, and they sowed late. Livestock farmers said that they stocked their animal, they sold out those animals. According to the respondents, their most urgent needs were seeds and planting material, marketing support, fertilizers, and pesticides. The livestock farmers' needs were feeds, marketing support, veterinary support, while the fishers, more equipment and material, marketing support, and so forth. Just one finding is that most affected farmers and fishers are casual and seasonal workers, women-headed households, those located far from the markets, and small-scale rain-fed farmers. This is a little bit to show some of the same findings I previously mentioned. So there was income losses and restrictions measures. How did their family income change? I mentioned this. So remember, there are 75% of them said they had difficulties in production, and some of these difficulties were heavy rainfall, flooded, and outbreak of pest disease, difficulty in accessing inputs. In terms of livestock, they had difficulty to access feed, supply chain issues, and mobility restrictions. For marketing and transportation, basically low level of sale, constraints due to the restrictions, COVID-19, low demand, and more clients asking to buy on credit, food traders or similar findings, issues with difficulties with transportation, and so forth. So the COVID-19 has cascading and similar indirect impacts on the livelihood of the farmers, fishers, vendors of agri-inputs, and food traders. COVID-19 has occurred on top of all the different shocks, such as heavy rainfall, outbreak of pests and disease, dry spell, droughts, and so forth. In addition, right now from reports, some farmers who are now finding relief from the COVID-19 due to the opening up of the economy. Hydromet recently announced the start of the second rainy season. And so we have been experiencing intense rainfall. So this is a second sets of flooding these farmers will be facing. So it's really important to learn how to strengthen the resilience among multiple hazards and risks for our farmers. And even though this survey is not statistically representative, we believe that the data that we have received here will valuable insight to support the decision making. How has government responded? So at first there were COVID-19 food hampers. Currently there is a distribution of relief cash voucher per household worth 25,000 Guyana dollars. And there are some social protection programs. There are measures like removal of VAT on electricity and water. Specifically for the agriculture sector, at the early stages, there are a kitchen garden initiative. Now we have, for example, government trying to do favorable environment and special incentive for farmers in private sectors, including removal of all taxes and duties on imports of agriculture machinery, equipment, and spares, reversal of land lease fees and D&I fees, removal of VAT on pesticides and agrochemicals, zero rating of VAT in the poultry industry, improvement of infrastructure, farm market access road and drainage and irrigation systems. There has been increase in outreaches to farming communities. There's, for example, the crops NARI has had a focus on reduction of pest and disease. There have been distribution of chemicals to farmers. Soon there'll be a program being rolled out to subsidize the cost of climate smart agriculture machinery. Those are the materials. Those are the shade house materials. There's decentralization of nurseries, special incentive for corn and soya producers to try to get more investors into the feed feed industry in the country. There's tax concession on investment in agro-processors facilities and so forth. In terms of the agro-processors, while the Small Business Bureau is not part of the ministry, there is a COVID-19 relief grant for food businesses and agro-processors and value-added producers. And finally, our needs and recommendations going forward is to continue the seeds and planting material and other urgent inputs needed to the farmers. And there are plans to have more market assistance through the public procurement and processing support. Medium term, um, like I mentioned, explore alternatives and local source of feeds to reduce the dependence on external supply and continue to provide access to much needed inputs, planting materials, etc. To link with social protection program to target agriculture sector households, um, update your agriculture disaster risk management plan, the long term to review experiences and lessons learned from COVID-19, and integrate these in our policies and frameworks and plans going forward, and to consider conducting risk profiling in the community level. I think we have started this, but to continue to do this. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brigitte Honorine. Thank you for indeed acknowledging that COVID-19 actually has unfolded on top of different hazards. And just to note to our colleagues who are watching today that Guyana is just one of the 13 countries who are part of this CARICOM FAO assessment on COVID-19 impacts. So moving on, we do know that COVID-19 is a risk. It's a hazard that's quite unfamiliar. Okay, something that we have never experienced before. But then the reality is that it does coincide with other hazards, including those that are familiar to us. And so with that, we would move to St. Lucia and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and we will ask our colleagues from these two countries to tell us how they managed to prepare for a very familiar hazard, which is hurricane, while at the same time responding to COVID-19. So first off, would like to call on Mr. Barry Innocent, the Deputy Director of Agriculture Services of the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, Physical Planning, Natural Resources, and Cooperatives of St. Lucia, to tell us more about this important topic or experience. So, Mr. Innocent, you have the floor, please. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roberta Sandoval, Dr. Jaria, the FAO officials, the organizational officials, the participants, and everyone at the sound of my voice. Good afternoon to you all. I'm glad to be part of this process as I endeavor, as Dr. Sandoval mentioned, to look at the hurricane preparedness and response planning in times of COVID-19 and looking at experiences from St. Lucia under the REACH project and other related activities or initiatives. My name, as he said, is Andrew Barry Innocent. Get into it quickly because we only have 10 minutes. Let me just say my approach I will look at is firstly, I will look at giving a brief background. Secondly, I will look at the Climate and Weather Outlook Forum as it refers to the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology and the St. Lucia Met Services. And thirdly, I will look at hurricane preparedness and response planning exercises, specifically the process involved, the outputs and products, and the learnings. Fourthly, I want to look at reflections on how to further strengthen preparedness and response for 2021 and beyond Atlantic hurricane season and other hazards. And fifthly, to look at other related activities or initiatives. A quick background. As we all know, global climate change has been problematic to sustainable development, especially for small island states like St. Lucia. We've had more hostile hurricanes like Maria in terms of how it affected Dominica, not us particularly. For us, it was Hurricane Thomas that had severe damages to us. In 2013, we had a Christmas Eve drought where about 6 people died. In 2010, we had a severe drought and then and many other climatic disasters that came through global climate change. We've also had some sea level rise and coastal erosion and saltwater water intrusion. St. Lucia limited resources requires cost-effective policies and measures, and valid data collection, collation, analysis, and interpretation are needed for these actions, for these cost-effective policies and measures to be effective. There's need for valid data collection, collation, analysis, and interpretation. And this is where the REACH project comes in, because it was through the REACH project that the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, CIMH, and the St. Lucia Met Services provides access to and joint management of agrometeorological information flows. And what is interesting about these information flows are it's on a two-way basis. It's a dialogue. The stakeholders, like the farmers, get a chance to receive information, but also they get a chance to give information. So it's a two-way basis. The other interesting thing is that it was jointly designed and implemented. So this is a highly participatory approach. And this participatory approach leads to adequate agricultural risk management and practices that enhance St. Lucia's rural development and agricultural development resilience. The hurricane preparedness and response planning exercises. In particular, I want to look at the process that was involved. We had virtual workshops that was done, and this was due to COVID-19. And this is how COVID-19 has affected the preparedness approach. Most of our training had to be done virtually. The hurricane preparedness and response planning was a major highlight of these virtual workshops, as we endeavor to look at different aspects of preparedness and different aspects of response. There was 3 days of virtual workshops, and the audience were the agricultural extension officers, the fisheries officers, the engineering officers, the vet and livestock officers, the research and development officers, the NEMO reps. There was Water Resources Management Agency reps, also Med Services reps. We had Dr. Jaria as an expert, a subject matter specialist, and we also had reps from CDEMA, the Caribbean Development and Emergency Management Agency. So these are some of the processes that were involved. The outputs or the products that we had as a result of this workshop was that we got data on the stakeholders in their own perception, what they deemed was their hurricane preparedness level, and what they think was missing in those hurricane preparedness plans and hurricane preparedness in particular. And interestingly so, what was the pivotal aspects that was submitted from the stakeholders as missing was the need for better timeliness of the information flows to farmers, and also more early or timely desilting of rivers, major drains, and farm drains. Additionally, additional early warning systems to provide information on coming hurricanes, floods, and other weather systems. And also, what they felt was missing was increased agromet and agricultural climatic data going to the farmers and also to the extension officers. Now, out of this whole process, there were learnings. The stakeholders learned certain things: how to reduce the impact of hurricane and other hazards and other disasters on the farming communities. They also learned where and how they can get information on early warning systems and agromet data. The data sources were identified, including the Met Services, the Water Resource Management Agency, the CIHM, weather outlooks, and through the Flood and Drought Mitigation Committee. Now, the Flood and Drought Mitigation Committee, they further served in the area by having these monthly presentations that was done where agencies like the Ministry of Health, the Water Resources Management Agency, and the Med Services got an opportunity to make presentations of relevant information to the agricultural sector. Now, there were certain reflections in terms of reflections on how to further strengthen preparedness and response for the 2021 and beyond Atlantic hurricane season and other hazards. These restrictions were obtained via questionnaires. That is, questionnaires were given, or will be given, I should say, questionnaires will be given to each of the regions. These questionnaires are intended for the farmers themselves through the assistance of the extension officers to fill out. The questions will ask the farmers questions like, how do they prefer to get the information flows? What is their preferred method of information flow or information channels? Whether they rather have it through the television, through the radio, through cell phone, through WhatsApp, or whether they want to have, whether they rather have information come to them through the extension officer. These are some of the data that will be captured for these reflections. And I should mention on Monday, the 9th of November, 2020, that's Monday coming, there'll be a training exercise for extension officers as to how to fill out those questionnaires when they go before the farmers. And each of the regions, St Lucia has 7 agricultural regions, agricultural districts right now. Each of those regions will be given 10 questionnaires. The questionnaires only have about 12 questions. But after the farmers have done all the due diligence in terms of filling out the questionnaire with the help of the extension officers, by the 30th of November 2020, the data will be collected, collated, and submitted to the communication auditing personnel of the REACH project. Further, I should mention a video on how to install the automatic weather stations or the agroclimatic stations will be submitted to participating countries, including St. Lucia. So that's something we have to look forward to in terms of the reflections on the way forward. And as I said before, the fifth thing I want to mention very quickly, because I only have 10 minutes, is just to mention to you a few other related activities and initiatives. The agrometeorological parameters will be monitored as part of the REACH project. I would like to mention that also. I would like to mention the agromet station. It is intended, or it is considered, to place it at the South Louis Community College School Farm in Dennery. Now, Dennery is almost the center part of the St. Lucia Island. We want to place it right there in the parameters of the school, the agricultural school, so that the farmers can get access to the data from it, the students can learn from it, and the students can also get access to data from it, and even the agricultural extension officers in the region or in that area can get access to it. I should also mention another initiative is there's a project called the 7 Crop Project in St. Lucia, where 7 specific crops were targeted in terms of reducing the food input bill on these crops. And the 7 Crop Project have their own agromet station that's also placed in the region free area. But that is considered for us as part of the REACH project as our means of verification of data from the agromet station that's already will be placed at the school and the one that the 7 Crop Project will be also installing. So it'll serve as a verification of data. Also, I should mention the Ministry of Agriculture in St. Lucia. We are currently reinstituting our disaster committee and strengthening our relationship with NEMO. As part of the reinstituting of the disaster committee, the comprehensive disaster plan that the ministry has, the committee will be assigned to look at it in terms of updating it and then to make it official. We also have what is called a hurricane response steps and guidelines that was created, and this particular document is intended so that every staff, every unit, every section, every division, every department understands what their role will be if there's a disaster and how to respond and what is expected of them. And every staff, both new and old, is intended to have a copy of that in their hands as part of our preparedness, hurricane preparedness methodology. And further, and lastly for now, the tissue culture lab in St. Lucia, they are in the process of looking at collecting genetic material for doing tissue culture on the very common foods that we use in St. Lucia, like the yams and other stuff like that. And what they're doing currently is to store it in tissue culture form, so that in case we have any major disaster and we lose all our crops, that we have a source of genetic material that can be quickly multiplied through tissue culture. So people, these are the other related activities and initiatives I wanted to mention to you. Let me just quickly say to you, because I only have 10 minutes and 10 minutes up, I think. Let me just say to you, thank you for your attention. And I guess if you have any questions, we will deal with that in the 20 minutes allotted to it. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Innocent, for sharing what you have been doing so far in St. Lucia, and how you are preparing for the next for next year's hurricane season. So now we move on to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I would like to call on Miss Debbie Daniel, Agriculture Planning Officer of the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, Fisheries, Rural Transformation, Industry, and Labor, to tell us about the experiences of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Uh, Miss Daniel, please, you have the floor and you have 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Roberto. Um, it is truly a great honor to be able to present on such an important topic and to represent St. Vincent and Grenadines. I want to start by providing a background information on St. Vincent and Grenadines as a gem of the Antilles. St. Vincent and Grenadines is an archipelagic state. The country is comprised of a main island, St. Vincent, and a chain of 32 islands and cays. The Grenadines, of which only 7 are inhabited, Bequia, Musty, Canawan, Mairo, Union Island, Palm Island, and Petit St. Vincent. Total area of the country is 150 square miles, 389 kilometers. It is important to know that as a small island developing state, we comprise of multiple islands. Next slide, please. We are highly vulnerable to external shocks and natural disasters. Geographic location is on the tropical cyclonic belt, highly exposed to meteorological and geophysical hazards. Economic risks are related to the country's dependency on agriculture and the service sectors. We have a natural asset base and 2 or more hazards with a significant impact on our GDP. We have been prone to multiple hazards. St. Vincent and Grenadines have been impacted by a number of events. I have a table that presents from since 1900 to 220. Earthquakes, floods, hurricanes and storms, volcanic eruptions, extended dry periods, and drought. In this year, we experienced a drought whereby rainfall for April was 60% below the average monthly figure. The month of May, rainfall fell from 248 millimeters in 2019 to 48. And the slide, next slide, illustrates the impact of the drought on the agriculture sector. And recently, last week, the heavy winds and heavy rainfalls that affected bananas and plantains. Both these hazards occurred at different periods, but all during the COVID pandemic. And the COVID pandemic itself has slowed down economic activity and disrupted our supply chains, unleashing new dynamics with cascading effects on food systems and food security and nutrition. Major disruptions to food supply chains have affected availability, prices, and quality of food. And closure of restaurants and other food services facilities has led to sharp decline in demand for certain perishable foods, including dairy products, fresh fruits, and vegetables. Next. The restricted movement of labor and food through the channel of international trade has especially affected by the lockdown measures. The closure of borders has resulted in the demand for certain food items dropped. Food producers resilient to distant export markets have become highly vulnerable, particularly producers of perishable foods, such as fresh fruits and vegetables. What I want to emphasize is that although we have hazards, we prepare for the hurricane season, we are now having more extended dry periods. 2020, we have experienced multiple hazards. We not only dealt with the COVID pandemic, we've dealt with the drought and a COVID pandemic. We're dealing with the drought and heavy rains and high winds. And we're dealing with a drought, heavy rains, high winds, and dengue. So we've had multiple hazards that are affecting not only the country and the agriculture, fisheries, and fishery sectors, which is having a profound impact on our farmers and fisher folk. Next slide. And the impact has affected food security and nutrition, livelihoods and income, the economy, trade, services, health, production, value chain. Next slide. And the reason why I wanted to give this background is that every year we prepare for the hurricane season. We're now focusing more on the impact of droughts due to climate change. And with all these changes, the government and the ministries have had to find ways to address the impacts of these multiple hazards at the same time. And this has resulted for farmers, especially disruption downstream for farm gates that have in some cases surplus accumulated, putting a strain on their storage and highly perishable increased food losses, especially in the effects of the other hazards. And with COVID, it has also led to a reduction in demand. So when reflecting back to what's been happening, the impact of the hazards or multiple hazards have on our economy. The COVID-19 pandemic showed that we were unprepared to cope with multiple hazards. We have always been dealing with one hazard, but not multiple hazards with that level of impact. Preparedness and response planning is key to risk management. The efficient and innovative use of available resources, the use of technology and risk management. And the reason I say that is because there has been an additional strain on the existing resources. During preparation for the hurricane season, practicing social distancing, along with having health concerns, has brought to the forefront the need for us to reprogram how we deal with risk management, especially in preparation for whether it's drought or hurricane preparedness and response. Next slide, please. Right. So for the government, during the pandemic and dealing with a drought and dealing with heavy rainfall and high winds, we had to look at maintaining the national food security by continuation of food production within a drought and and a hurricane season, sustain farmers' livelihoods in rural agricultural communities in light of this disruption of the food distribution in the context of COVID, increase productive capacities to take advantage of potential strategic investments, collaborate with the private sector to mitigate disruption of food and feed system, and smoothing the access to food to ensure continuity of food for the food insecure. Next slide, please. Right. And what this has highlighted to us is that the dramatic ways that is needed for better disaster preparedness. Now, the government of St Vincent and the Grenadines, through the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, Fisheries, Rural Transformation, Industry and Labour, has engaged in an initiative, which is the REACH project, Resilience, Environment and Agriculture, Caribbean Habitat, in collaboration with SEDIMA, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, the Italian International Center on Environmental Monitoring Research Foundation, and FAO. And the aim of the project is to improve the food, nutrition, resilience, and natural and social economic shocks with climate change. And what this project has enabled us to do is to look at the ways to develop a two-way community-driven mechanism for joint management and knowledge sharing. Appropriate practices and technologies for natural resource management and agricultural risk management take into the account indigenous knowledge and relevant information to promote resilient rural livelihoods in the context of disaster risk management. Let's see. So what we have developed activities that have happened so far. We had a 5-day virtual training with extension officers, scientists, technicians, farmers, fisher folk, and other external agency, creating a forum for discussions, looking at ways where we could improve on hurricane preparedness, adapting and mitigating risks. And we also had 2 climate change forums hosted by CMH, which showed the importance of the technicians from different specialized areas working together to deal with disaster risk management. And it's interesting that from the predictions of the CMH that the increased rainfalls that were predicted is what actually occurred last week. So that helped us in many ways in terms of preparing. And we also went further. We have existing disaster collection tools and templates. And what we did is look at these tools and templates in ways in terms of introducing technologies like GPS. So you would have coordinates. We also looked at how remote mapping could play a part in terms of how we collect data, comprehensive data that would aid in decision making. And we're looking at drafting our disaster collection manual specifically, because we already have a draft agriculture disaster plan. What we need is other complementary support to aid in terms of how you collect the data, and the framework. So it would ease in terms of making sure that what is collected will show a reflection of what's on the ground. We also have under the project where we'll be getting automated weather station. We have automated weather stations, and we already have automated weather stations, which is under the Central Water and Sewage Authority. But this automated weather station also records levels of pests and diseases, which is advanced technology on existing technology we have. And we're also going to implement a communication audit tool, something we could use in the future. Next slide, please. Right, and these are the products that I wanted you to see that we had, and the changes in terms of our tools. Next slide. Right. So what's next? In terms of hurricane preparedness and response for St Vincent and the Grenadines, especially agriculture, fisheries, and forestry sector for 2021. We're going to continue strengthening our early warning systems. We are looking at drone technology and how that could be used to aid in the collection of data and forms of imagery pre and post disaster. We're looking at how we could strengthen our food and feed systems in terms of the technologies that we use in terms of rain-fed irrigation, um, heat tolerant, and tagging them in such a way that we know and mapping so we know where our resources are, where are the most hazardous areas are. So we have that information. We're going to further strengthen our data collection and management systems using tablets instead of using the paper form of collection data. Next one, please. We're going to look at enhancing market and distribution systems that use a platform base, which could be ideal in terms of preparedness, that information links to how we prepare and mitigate impacts. Develop and implement media education and interactive tools. We've already started an agriculture extension app, which works, farmers have access to and extension officers. We looking at strengthened institutional collaboration. We work very closely with NEMO and other agencies, but COVID has taught us that we need to work even closer in terms of managing the disease, the disasters and the risks that may present themselves. But we're also going to look at developing a communication tool with CMH and CDMA in terms of providing that information, readily information to farmers through various platforms, social network platforms, advising them of not only preparing for a hurricane, but other hazards such as pests, drought, that would affect their livelihoods. Next slide. And I would like to end saying that resilience is key to sustainable development. And we have recognized through COVID the importance of technology and how it was underutilized. And the way forward for us will be focusing on embracing technology on various platforms to enhance preparedness and disaster response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Daniel, for sharing with us your experiences and also again confirming the challenges that we have when we have to deal with uh, multiple hazards and multiple risks, including those that are systemic in nature. So now, oops, sorry. Okay, so now we move on to another presentation that also is going to deal or talk about, hurricane preparedness. And with this, we have our colleague with us, Dr. Iris Monroe, the regional project coordinator of the CC4Fish project, to tell us on how to improve hurricane preparedness response and recovery of the fisheries sector in the Caribbean. So, Dr. Monroe, you have the floor, please, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I will go into full screen. So I am the Regional Project Coordinator of the CC for Fish project, which stands for Climate Change Adaptation of the Eastern Caribbean Fisheries Sector, based at FAO in Barbados. And I'm going to take you to the fisheries sector to talk about, improving hurricane preparedness, response, and recovery. Fisheries is at the front line of the impacts of hurricanes and very vulnerable because obviously fisher folk are located in the coastal zone as well as all their assets, so boats, fisheries infrastructure, and so on, but also because the environments that they depend on, for example, coral reefs and mangroves, are also usually heavily affected by hurricanes. So the outline of my presentation today is to talk about some of the impacts of hurricanes on the fisheries sector in the Caribbean region as we've seen to date, and then I'm highlighting particularly the experiences of Dominica and the Bahamas. And then I'm talking about some actions that either have been taken or could be taken along the disaster risk management cycle. So in terms of mitigation, prevention, relief, and recovery. And I'm basing that both on what CC for Fish has been doing, but also in terms of other projects, and as well as what could potentially be done and should be done in the region to improve hurricane preparedness of the fisheries sectors and decrease impact. And then I'll give some reflections and lessons learned. So Hurricane Maria was, a very heavy Category 5 hurricane that impacted Dominica, their worst natural disaster on record, which heavily impacted the fisheries sector. These pictures are taken by me when I went there 5 weeks after Hurricane Maria hit to help my national colleagues to look at the damages and needs of the fisheries sector. 40% of the fishing vessels and engines were either heavily damaged or destroyed. But as you can see here, it's not just boats and engines and so on, it's also all the way up the fisheries chain. So the picture you see in the left bottom are what we call the locker rooms, which is the locker rooms that market vendors use to put their coolers to store their equipment and so on, which were also, a lot of the buildings were destroyed, but also all of their equipment, as well as the fish in storage. Some other examples is for the picture you see here of the fuel station. The fuel pump is completely ripped out. In the back, you see the container, which is actually the office of one of the fishing co-ops, which had an ice machine and was the cooperative office. So that obviously limited the ability for available fuel and ice for fishers to go out. And then there is Fisheries Division. You can see the incredible damage to Fisheries Division in Rio. Yeah, I see someone doing a chat, but I can't see the chat. As you can imagine, it's the computers, the equipment, the office was entirely destroyed, and most of the data of the fisheries sector in the country, a lot of the data was lost. So it's difficult, you can imagine, to manage a fishery under these kind of circumstances after a hurricane. You can also imagine some of the environmental impacts. If you have a fishery that's close to the coast and you have a lot of outflow and debris, especially in Dominica from these rivers, the bottom pictures are taken when I went back on a visit to see, the rehabilitation of the fisheries sector. These pictures are taken 18 months after Hurricane Maria. And what you can see is that, there's still a lot of work done in the river beddings, which leads to a lot of outflow, which obviously heavily affects coastal fisheries. The other picture I actually just took off the net, which is on the Bahamas. The Perry Institute has been seeing great damages, after Hurricane Dorian on the marine resources in the Bahamas. But you also see, as you see in these pictures, which is taken 5 weeks after Hurricane Maria, when they're already selling fish. The top is in Russo and the bottom is on the East Coast. That fish is very important as part of food security after a disaster and should be taking, the importance of that should be highlighted. We also saw a lot of flexibility of fishers moving from inshore and offshore depending on what was possible and what fisheries were not affected. A lot of fishers also ended up being involved in, for example, construction, but also in transport. Those that still had boats were doing a lot of transport to the surrounding islands and still do. I'm not going into the details of the Bahamas because, as everybody highlighted, we only have 10 minutes, but this is just a few pictures to highlight that it was a similar situation in the Bahamas. 80% of the fisheries sector in Grand Bahama and Abaco was either destroyed or significantly damaged, whereas those two islands together are responsible for 40% of the entire fish production in the Bahamas. So the same kind of, a lot of damages to the fishing vessels, to the middlemen's buying stations. On the right, you see a fuel station, and then down below the processing plants, because obviously the Bahamas depends to a high degree on lobster fisheries exports. When you take into consideration the disaster risk management cycle in fisheries, so you look at mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So I've made a few notes of areas to look at, but this list is not exhaustive. It's just some areas that we, as in CC for Fish, the project, but also other projects, that is very important. And I just wanted to highlight that here. So in terms of mitigation, you can think of, for example, safe harbor plans. This is both at the community level, but you can do it at the national level. Safety at sea training, basically collection of baseline data, damage and needs assessment. In terms of preparedness, early warning systems. And also the use, putting in place the safe harbor plans, radio communication. And then in terms of response, the post-disaster damage and needs assessment, immediate after response, and then you have a longer term one. And as FAO, we also obviously look into response for the response into grant mobilization. And then there's a longer term recovery in terms of the PD&A damage assessment, the rehabilitation, getting equipment, new equipment and gears, and building back better. Not just building to where it was, but trying to really improve climate resilience and environmental sustainability. So for all these areas, I will highlight some of the areas that we've been working on. We have to depart from the fact that fishery is already one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, and improving safety and communication with fishers who are such at the front line is very important. The right picture is taken recently from a video that was sent from fishers in Dominica. So you can see the danger that fishermen face. So in case of early warning and improved safety, some of the areas that that's been working on is mobile apps to improve communication, early warning, and vessel tracking. A suite of apps is already developed under a project called Fisheries, which is led by the CRFM under the Fewer project, whereby CC for Fish improved some of the implementation of these apps. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But also in terms of VHF radio, being able to reach fisher folk and telling them about the upcoming weather or in case of need. A lot of fisher folk don't have VHF radios or don't know how to use that. So under CC for Fish, we distributed 1,200 radios across the Eastern Caribbean, but we also had to build repeater systems because, VHF radios only work in line of sight. So you have to build a repeater system in order to increase the range. And then when you look at these ICT, so where we started with trying to improve the implementation of these apps, we also realized that there were a lot of fisher folk who were obviously not as ICT literate. So we ended up developing 3 different levels. So from basic to general to specialized, whereas with basic ICT training of fisher folk, you really just look at how can they improve their battery life, for example, so that they have a longer period that they can reach. For example, the Coast Guards. Do you have the number of the Coast Guards in your phone? To more generalized, to really have these specialized ICT literacy in terms of using those apps. We also did a regional training on post-disaster damage and needs assessment. This is very important because FAO has developed guidelines to do these PDNAs for the fisheries sector. But in the region, at the time when CC for Fish started, there had no training been done in the region. And what happens, or what can happen after hurricanes, is that the fisheries sector, is often considered very complex. There's a lack of data. There might not be good communication between fisheries office and disaster risk management, and they might not know about the details of fisheries. So we brought the 2 sectors together, the DRM personnel and the fisheries officers, and train them in using these guidelines. So you have a network of PDNA people that can actually do these PDNAs after disaster, and the fisheries sector is incorporated appropriately into these PDNAs, because if they're not appropriately incorporated, they might not get the relief and rehabilitation funds from donors that the sector needs to rebuild. We're also doing this at the moment in Grenada at the community level. So we're training people, leaders and stakeholders in the communities to do these PDNA at the local level right after a hurricane. So it's important to work on social protection and insurance so that when there are issues that fisher folk have insurance. Right now, only 3% has special insurance. Very few have health insurance and life insurance. So this is not just related to hurricanes, but more to social protection in general. But this is something that we also like to work on, and we're now developing a project with the Caribbean Development Bank to develop social protection schemes in 3 Eastern Caribbean islands. There's also the Coast Project, which is works with parametric insurance for the fishing sector, which kicks into place after an extreme weather event. And then there's hurricane preparedness. So for example, brochures and posters in terms of telling, explaining to fisher folk what they can be doing in terms of improving their preparedness, both for their vessel, but also in terms of, make sure that you have all your documents in a waterproof bag, make sure you take out money. So, if in case there's I remember after, Dominica, only after 5 weeks did the ATMs work again. But you can also have preparedness plans in terms of where do you put your boats? Is there a field designated in your community where you can put your boats? And then obviously work on those plans. So I was telling a little bit about these PDNAs. So in terms of the immediate response, you can go in and do the PDNAs looking at the fishing gears and vessels and engines and the damages to that, but also in terms of fisheries, aquaculture policy and management. So has there been, you also look at not only the loss of lives of the fisher folk, but also of for example, the fisheries officer. We saw not a loss of life in the Bahamas, but great trauma amongst the fisheries officers based in Abaco and Grand Bahama. So these are things you need to take into account. And also obviously damages to the assets of the government. We saw a lot of, lost boats and engines, which obviously impact management. You look at landing sites, harbors, anchors, aquaculture, post-harvest markets and processing, and obviously environmental impacts I was discussing before. So the coral reefs and mangroves and seagrass beds and so on. And then you look also at the economic losses to the sector. So what is the loss of income, now that the fishery has suffered this great disaster, and what would that cost? What would be the cost to the sector? And then developing a needs assessment plan for the short, medium, and long term. Obviously looking at building back better. So using hurricane strapped water catchment system, renewable energy, and so on. When we looked at the Bahamas, we had 2 trips with the various experts. And one of the main things we found, what we suffered from doing the PDNA, and I just like to highlight it here, was the limited baseline information. There was no vessel registry, no registered fisher folk. FAO had started a project with the Bahamas, but that had not been implemented due to some national challenges. And there was very limited fish catch data. So it's very hard to establish the damages and needs assessment when you don't have that sort of baseline information. If, for example, in terms of the catches, you have the official catches, but then the government themselves said, well, yeah, but the actual catches are 2 to 3 times higher than that. So these rough estimates are quite hard to work with, and really make it an estimate of an estimate of an estimate. The fishermen were also difficult to be found in the case of Grand Bahama and Abaco because they'd all left the island. So talking to fisher folk, which sounds easy, was actually increasingly, it was very complicated. We did end up calculating it was damages worth of 22.7 million, which majority was to gears, condos. And the losses only up to December 2020, which is what we calculated, was 28.6 million because they were responsible for 40% of the catches. A lot of lobster which were exported. It was a great loss to the country. And then you also have the rehabilitation. So for the Bahamas, FAO has a project of 400,000 to provide equipment and coordination. We also, for example, had a project, CC for Fish, supported some of the rehabilitation in Dominica for the sector in terms of some equipment, not just for fisher folk, but also for across the value chain. So cutting boards and so on for the market vendors, but also computer equipment and some office equipment for fisheries division. And in terms, you can also look at, so vessels and gears and vendors equipment that could be distributed in terms of rehabilitation, but also infrastructure. So you saw after Hurricane Dominica, a lot of boat sheds were rebuilt. These locker rooms were rebuilt. And in terms of getting the fuel stations back up and running and the ice machines. Some of the rehabilitation effort in Dominica included cash transfers. So giving fisherfolk cash, which also led to some, some fisherfolk felt like they didn't get the cash transfers, as you can see in the picture below. More safe boats, and obviously improving the availability of ice. Some of the things that we saw after 18 months was that, and things to keep in mind for the future, is the limited building back better of infrastructure. For example, we didn't really see hurricane straps used very much in these things that were rebuilt, or the use of renewable energy, which could be things that, for when building back after other hurricanes would be something to keep in mind. We also saw some mismatch between donors. You see on the left bottom, these are these big coolers that fish vendors and processors use to cool their fish. But then from the donors, they would get these sort of small party coolers, which wouldn't hold the fish, or they get very small cutting boards and knives. So these are things to keep in mind. We do have one more, success story that we have in Dominica, is that there was a government-operated shrimp hatchery, which was destroyed by Hurricane Erika Marie in 2016 and 17. And the farmers didn't have the seed supply anymore because of that destruction. So Undersea for Fish FAO partnered with the government and rehabilitated the farm, keeping in mind this sort of building climate change resilience. So we built concrete walls around the structure. There were hurricane roof ties were used for the rafters. And as a result, in August 2020, it was the first shrimp harvest. So some reflections was that I'd like to keep in mind is that the fisheries sector is in fact highly vulnerable to these extreme weather events, but that the disaster risk management as a whole for the fisheries sector is still quite limited, and something that that we're convinced needs improvement and should get special attention because it's important. Some practical avenues that we've seen is improved safety, including this ICT training, enhanced insurance and social protection initiative, development of disaster risk preparedness plans specifically for the fisheries sector, both at the national and the community level, and the great importance to establish these improved baseline data systems to incorporate the fisheries sector well in terms of these PDNAs, and to further enhance this post-disaster damage and needs assessment network at both the regional, national, and local level. And that we ensure that we integrate building back better in all aspects of the disaster risk management cycle, while at the same time keeping in mind that no size fits all. The impacts will be very different, the fisheries will be different, the responses will be different. So while we use for example, the guidelines and our experiences, whether a fishery is an export fishery or not, will have a difference. The technical capacity of fisheries division will obviously impact a lot in terms of responses. So you have to keep, every situation is still different and every disaster is different. But at the same time, we can look at the best practices and lessons learned as we move along. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Monroe. So just a quick note to our colleagues who are watching this event. Please feel free to type your questions in the YouTube comment box, and then my colleague Martina will take care and make sure that these are raised after the presentations. So we have been discussing COVID-19 impacts, hurricane preparedness, and other hazards that have been affecting the region and the different countries in the region. So now let's zoom out a bit, and from field level perspectives, let's zoom out and let's see at the strategic and policy level. I mean, how are we trying to transform agriculture into something to transform agriculture and make it more resilient? So we are fortunate today to have Dr. Naja Paquet-Ansem, the agriculture sector growth specialist of the Climate Resilience Execution Agency of Dominica, or CREED, to walk us through on how they are doing this and towards transformative and resilient agriculture in Dominica, and how they are applying innovative thinking on risk and resilience. So over to you, Dr. Paquet-Ansem. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto, and also a pleasant good afternoon to my fellow colleagues in terms of presentation here this afternoon, as well as the viewers via YouTube. Having experienced Hurricane Maria myself in September of 2017, what resonates with me is what was echoed by our Honorable Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit at the United Nations General Assembly in 2017, and I quote, "I come to you straight from the line of the war on climate change. To deny climate change is to deny a truth we have just lived. We as a country and as a region did not start this war against nature. We did not provoke it. The war came to us." Dominica, like many of the other Caribbean islands, is quite vulnerable to the effects of climate and many other hazards. I will focus primarily on the effects of storms and hurricanes. Dominica has been strategically located in terms of almost being in the path of every single event that comes our way in terms of the Caribbean and hurricanes and storms. In terms of our geology, we are strategically placed in terms of being vulnerable. From 1979 up to 2017, when we experienced Hurricane Maria, we can attest to the fact that approximately 17 storms and hurricanes have affected the island, and the consequences thereafter on the agriculture sector has been severe. In addition, Dominica is, in terms of its terrain and topography, has 30 degrees or more found in about 60% of the island. Our country is also characterized by soils which are extremely prone to landslides. And we can also note that when we were affected by Tropical Storm Erika in 2015, the landslides was quite severe, which affected primarily one of our areas of bay oil production, noting that the entire community had to be replaced, or what I said, moved in terms of the effect of landslides. The regional vulnerability and benchmark tool has also placed Dominica low as it relates to capacities for risk identification, risk mitigation, risk transfer, recovery, and rehabilitation. This creates major challenges for attaining national development goals and continues to threaten the nation's food and nutrition security, the aspects of livelihoods, and particularly those of the rural farm families and fisher folks across the island. In terms of the economic impact of hurricanes on the agricultural sector, we can actually highlight that the effect of not only hurricanes but storms has been way in the millions and has affected particularly our gross domestic product. Hurricane David in 1979, for example, plummeted our GDP by agriculture GDP by 32%. Tropical Storm Erika in 2015 produced estimated losses in the country estimated at $109 million, and specifically recovery loss in terms of agriculture of approximately $13 million. With the passage of Hurricane Maria, the Commonwealth of Dominica has experienced the worst hydrometeorological hazard in recent times. The agriculture sector, which constitutes of not only crop but livestock, fisheries, and forestry, represented 16% of total damage and loss, corresponding to over $570 million, Eastern Caribbean dollars. Damage and losses in the agriculture sector were quite extensive, affecting all aspects of agricultural production. Damages in the forestry sector were estimated at US $30 million, with an initial recovery valued at US $15 million. Overall loss in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, was way over 226%. One can also allude to the fact that post the event of a natural disaster in terms of a hurricane or a storm, the secondary effects which also pursues us are almost always the introduction of emergent pests and diseases, particularly scale insects. Over the last 10 years more or so, Dominica has been severely affected by the giant African snail, diseases affecting citrus, the black sigatoka, which has affected tremendously our potential in terms of export opportunities for bananas and plantains. The Gulf rust disease affecting our bay oil industry, one of the most prominent subsectors within the agricultural sector. And as I mentioned earlier on, scale insects. This has provided a significant drawdown from the pool of resources of central government coffers, whereby millions of dollars are required annually to control these emerging pests and diseases. It is definitely not a myth how important the sector is in terms of its contribution to GDP in Dominica. And as I have highlighted here, agriculture's contribution to GDP has been in the range of 14% to approximately 19%. Of course, the effect of Hurricane Maria in 2017 would have allowed a decline in our contribution, in the contribution of agriculture to GDP in 2018. And we can see a move more or so over of 16% in 2017 to about 14% in 2018. The agriculture sector accounts for 21% of our labor force directly, and it is, of course, a critical foundation for rural livelihoods, socioeconomic growth, and food security. The vulnerability of the agriculture sector to natural and man-made hazards presents a real threat to sustainable socioeconomic growth at the national level, and of course, our ability in achieving the SDGs. Disasters and crises don't have immediate short-term effects. They, of course, undermine livelihoods and national development gains that have taken years to build. And I quote from FAO in 2016 that the resilience of the agricultural livelihoods is key to making sustainable development a reality by ensuring that agriculture and food systems are productive and risk-sensitive in order to feed present and future generations. This is one of the photos taken by one of our elite photographers, Yuri, which actually transcends into, a nation in chaos post Hurricane Maria. And I ask of myself, what does this transformative process entail? And what is required for us to move forward in terms of being a much more resilient nation, a nation where agriculture, of course, is based on principles of risk mitigation and climate risk management. We are tasked here in terms of as a nation and in terms of a collaborative effort with a number of key partners, including the Ministry of Blue and Green Economy, Agriculture, and National Food Security, as well as the International Institute for Cooperation and Agriculture, and of course, one of our critical partners, the FAO, in developing what is referred to as a well-informed and articulated national agriculture policy. This policy, of course, establishes tangible goals, clear direction, and guidelines for the Ministry of Blue and Green Economy, and of course, the wider sector. The policy supports climate risk management through technologies and approaches, integrating, of course, approaches related to climate smart agriculture, financial innovation principles, including de-risking agriculture through microfinance and micro-insurance schemes, and other opportunities for incentives in terms of the approach to climate smart agriculture. We are also in the process in terms of a nation of transforming the agricultural sector, using creative and innovative principles, including the Global Center for Agricultural Resilience, which will be the first among small island developing states. And this transformative process is expected to define a strategic roadmap for transforming the agricultural sector, to develop and deliver a medium long-term action plan to transform the sector, as well as to develop key and strategic awareness and capacity building programs, all geared towards ensuring that processes are supported by knowledge and experience on food and agriculture resilience. Some of the key activities to date include institutionalizing DRM. And again, as this is very, very keenly supported by the works of the FAO and integral participation of the key actors within the agricultural sector. And this disaster risk management plan and hurricane preparedness plan towards a sustainable, productive agricultural sector, which transcends socioeconomic development through improved disaster risk management. We are also, in addition to central government coffers, or I should say government PSIPs, public sector investment programs, we have strategically and keenly worked with a number of key donor agencies, and we are quite thankful for the support that has been provided to us post Hurricane Maria and onwards in building this transformative process towards a resilient agricultural sector. And I will highlight just a few among a number of initiatives that are currently ongoing, including the World Bank supported agriculture project, the Dominica Emergency Agricultural Livelihoods and Climate Resilience Project, which is a recovery effort in terms of supporting fisher folks, crop and livestock farmers, as well as key actors within the agricultural sector, including physical infrastructure within the Ministry of Agriculture, all encompassing climate resilient principles and efforts in terms of building back better. There is also an ongoing project, the United Nations Development Program funded project, which is aimed at strengthening disaster management capacity of women in Dominica, valued at over $2 million US. We have also received and keenly been supported by the Inter-American Corporation for Agriculture in terms of a number of projects that are aimed at building resilience in the agricultural sector. And I will name particularly the ecologically based approaches and development of the vetiver grass systems in the eastern community of Petite Savanne and other eastern communities across the island. We are now currently reviewing our energy policy to encompass facets of green energy. And this is an ongoing effort, which we hope to try to have concluded by the end of this year. And as a response to COVID-19, in terms of our era where food security was actually at the forefront, opportunities were also presented to meet local demands by providing planting material and small tools and equipment to a number of smallholder farmers, including backyard farmers. I will also highlight here the NRDS, which is the National Resilient Development Strategy up to 2030, which has now been translated into the Climate Resilient Recovery Plan. A copy of that plan, of course, can be found on the CRIDRA website, and it actually highlights a roadmap for recovery, which translates Dominica's vision of becoming the first climate nation into specific activities which ought to be implemented by 2030. And I will highlight that, of course, to finance resilience is really and truly an expensive venture. And this CRRP highlights some key facets and pillars that are required to build on this vision, which is to become the very first climate resilient nation among states. Some of the critical next steps, and one should highlight that in terms of building resilience in the agricultural sector, the facets of community resilience in terms of social consciousness and economic resilience are also key and integral components. And these are also some of the pillars that are considered in terms of the work going forward. The Global Center for Agricultural Resilience is one of the 10 priority pillars considered within the Climate Resilient Recovery Plan. It's basically ranked at number 7, and it highlights all of the key facets that are required to transcend Dominica's agriculture in terms of building components of resilience, risk mitigation, and risk management. Improved capacity of the key actors in terms of incorporating resilience is critical and needs to be an ongoing effort in terms of knowledge building and knowledge harnessing. Data management is also one of the core components which is important in terms of ensuring that baselines are recognized or highlighted and are managed. One of the issues that was quite critical for us in terms of our recovery efforts post-Hurricane Maria was the issue of not having the level of scientific data which was required, or baselines which is required to make that level of improvement or change in terms of where we will and where we ought to be in terms of bouncing back or building back better. There are current efforts ongoing at the level of the Ministry of Agriculture and the government of Dominica in terms of data management systems. We also recognize the continuous need to improve and introduce high-yielding and tolerant breeds and crop varieties in terms of the way forward in building back better. The continuous harnessing of marketing intelligence and penetration of smallholder farmers do require that level of support in terms of growing crops based on seasonality and based on other hazards that will affect them during the course of a given productive year. Adopting climate smart and innovative technology. Of course, incentives for climate smart investment is critical and a core pillar, which we recognize should be part of a policy-driven direction. Assessing climate financing is something that should not only be considered post a natural disaster, but should be an ongoing effort in terms of building that level of financial capability in terms of moving forward. Innovative insurance opportunities are also critical, and we are now hearing of some quite innovative opportunities in terms of parametric and blockchain insurances, which could also be critical and important for smallholder farmers. And as I said earlier on, economic resilience is core and key through increased sustainable food systems and value-added initiatives. Continuous investment opportunities surrounding the blue and green economy, innovative opportunities towards import substitution. And I would also like to end by highlighting some core and critical words from our Honorable Minister of Finance and Prime Minister, Honorable Roosevelt Skerrit, at this year's budgetary address, and I will quote that government has pursued a deliberate policy aimed at enhancing the production capacity of small-scale farmers and improving their social and economic resilience. There definitely is no doubt that the population is largely now convinced that there are myriad opportunities in agriculture. We are committed to working with our farmers and fisher folks to ensure that this sector plays a critical role in building the dynamic Dominica. We will continue to encourage and partner with farmers to build a sustainable agriculture sector that will further boost regional trade, complement our efforts at expanding agro-processing, and support the diversification of our tourism product into agritourism. The objective of this government is to continue to implement policies which will result in a sustainable agriculture system that will guarantee food security, rural livelihoods, economic development, and growth. And with these words, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paquet Ansam, for sharing with us how Dominica is trying to promote this enabling environment for transformative and resilient agriculture. And somehow, I hope that your this one somehow, puts the pieces together and links it to the other examples that and experiences that we have seen so far from our colleagues from the other countries. So now we move on to the last presentation for this session. So we would like to call on Mr. Sandiford Edwards, the CARICOM FAO Program Liaison, to present to us the Caribbean Regional Emergency Response Strategy and Action Plan. Again, we zoom out at the regional level and see how we could link a field level, national level plans to regional level ones. So, Mr. Edwards, you have the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto, my colleague, and good afternoon to all our listeners and viewers on this very important topic, looking at the emergency response strategy and action plan for agriculture within the Caribbean or within CARICOM. And that emergency response strategy, I think, fits in nicely with many of the presentations that we've experienced before, looking at the country analysis, where we looked at Guyana, St Vincent, St Lucia, Dominica, and even building on the work or the presentation that Iris would have done as it relates to the fishery sector. Right, so the genesis of the emergency response strategy and action plan, even before we get there, there is a backdrop that I think we need to understand, that disasters are real, they are present, and they will happen. And sadly, the Caribbean, we've experienced a number of natural disasters and man-made disasters, and even recently, looking at COVID-19, which would have threatened food security in the region. During a disaster or after a disaster, people need to eat. So food security is extremely important. We do have a regional food and nutrition security strategy in the Caribbean. But despite that strategy, we also have a growing food input bill. The emergency response strategy is prepared in the context of how do we ensure that our preparation ahead of a disaster is robust enough so that we can mitigate the effects. How do we respond in the case of a disaster? And then most importantly, it looks at the recovery and the rehabilitation. It is also prepared in the context where some countries have more advanced, what I call disaster infrastructure in place, whilst others do not have such infrastructure. And so we need to be able to capture a mechanism that can allow the different countries within the CARICOM space to be able to mitigate a disaster. So in 2014, the Quoted Agriculture, they would have approved a number of different institutions and coordination mechanisms to strengthen agriculture development. Those would have identified what we consider to be the binding constraints. What are the things that are preparing agricultural development in the region? And very often we see agriculture as not being important or not being sexy. But when there is a disaster, or when there is a challenge, or when there is a crisis, even like now during COVID, we saw long lines, etc., in supermarkets. Most people were concerned about the access to food. That agriculture has become center stage. And it is at this time center stage. Even the heads of government would have challenged the private sector to find ways to reduce the region's food input bill by 25% by the time we get to 2025. So the coordinating mechanisms as designed by the CARICOM infrastructure looks at what is called the institutional framework, and that is led by what is called the Agriculture, Food and Nutrition Cluster. That cluster is made up of a number of different institutions, regional institutions, development partners, and that is the body that comes together to look at a cohesive and a coordinated approach as it relates to agricultural development. They provide technical information to our ministers of agriculture in the region to ensure that policies are coherent, to ensure that policies are transformative, and that the policies will ensure that food security and nutritional adequacy of the CARICOM space is maintained. The institutional framework in the region also speaks to technical working groups. So there are various technical working groups that are formed to ensure that different aspects of agriculture is considered. When we speak of agriculture, it's beyond crops. We're speaking of livestock. We are speaking of fisheries and aquaculture. We are speaking of forestries, crops. We're speaking of value addition in terms of agribusinesses, etc. The institutional framework also has thematic groups, and one such thematic group is called climate change, disaster risk management, and natural resource management. And then we also have priority commodities. What are the commodities in the region that the CARICOM member states can be competitive in? So roots and tubers, we have small ruminants, we have coconuts, we have herbs and spices. Those are all priority commodity groups that exist to ensure that the region can develop. The genesis of the emergency response strategy and action plan originated from the devastation which was caused in 2017, and my colleague from Dominica would have highlighted that, so no need to go it over again. But coming out of the events of hurricanes Irma and Maria, the regional agriculture sector came under scrutiny, and what was found to be missing was that coordinated approach. How can we respond in a cohesive manner, bringing developmental partners, bringing countries together to ensure that in the event of a disaster, we are not what is called tripping over ourselves, or we are double counting, but to ensure that we can take a strategic approach. So the quartet in 2017 then requested the thematic group on climate change, disaster risk management, and natural resource management to give priority to the establishment of a regional agriculture emergency subcommittee to ensure that we could have brought some focused attention and bring the necessary capacity to develop a strategy and action plan to ensure that we can build the resiliency of the food sector in the region, considering the importance and the right to food for every citizen within the region. That responsibility was basically to inform and to support the development and implementation of a strategy and action plan that is going to put the regional agriculture sector on a firm footing in the event of a catastrophe. Hence, we speak of the emergency response strategy. That subgroup consisted of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, as the lead, the Caribbean Community Secretariat, meaning the CARICOM Secretariat, CDEMA as the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, that regional institution that is tasked with emergency management in the region. They were quite pivotal in being a part of that subcommittee. And then we also had the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, as well as the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. Those were the core members of the subgroup, but supported by the wider Caribbean community. So the ministries of agriculture, the ministries of disaster management, and other development partners in the region were all part of the preparation of this important strategy or document. What is the intention? The intention of the emergency response strategy is not to come and reinvent the wheel, or it's not to come and write a new document to put on the shelf, but it's basically to provide an implementation mechanism that focuses on agriculture resilience building. Because very often we look at the building codes, we look at strengthening those building codes so that new construction, etc., will be built to withstand Category 5 hurricanes, would be built to withstand earthquakes. We looked at our drainage and our infrastructure to ensure that the roads can live up to the weights of vehicles. We look at our flooding mechanisms, etc. But at times, sometimes agriculture gets left in the mix in terms of resilience building. So the emergency response strategy fits into the CDEMA strategy for disaster response in the region. So disaster is going to be looked at holistically, not just in terms of infrastructure, but also on food. It also going to look at the health aspect. It builds on current initiatives and established mechanisms of various agencies. So where there is a CARDI in the region, and IECA and FAO, who are performing specific functions where there is CREED in Dominica, or there is a specific disaster management agency in member states in the region, you find that the emergency response strategy would take into consideration those established mechanisms, would take into consideration those initiatives that are on the ground, and seek to scale it up in a joined up fashion. Additionally, it looks at ex ante, meaning before events or before a crisis. It looks at the preparedness. How do we prepare? How do we take a proper inventory of our agriculture stocks? How do we look at our early warning systems? How do we ensure that we introduce greater climate smart agriculture and greater climate resilient practices in our production systems? So it looks at ex ante events, and then it also looks at ex post events. How do we respond in the event of a crisis, and how do we recover and rehabilitate so that we can build forward? We can build, not just build back, but we build back better or building forward. It is also flexible in its recognition of the fact that the agriculture sector is different, and that the impact is different from in various member states. So not all communities within a specific country will be affected the same way. Not all sectors of agriculture will be affected the same way. So for example, in a member state that relies on fruit trees, the fruit trees will be affected differently than a member state who is heavily involved in short crops, or a member state who is heavily involved in animal rearing, where the infrastructure, the animal houses, have been built to withstand various natural disasters. So the impact is different, and so the focus of the emergency response strategy seeks to recognize that difference, not just within the CARICOM space, but seeks to recognize the difference within a specific country or member state. And it also includes actions to build back better, as I've said, to ensure that the agriculture sector is placed on a stronger footing. So how do we better integrate technology, agriculture technology in the whole aspect of building the sector forward, making use of artificial intelligence, making use of big data, making use of weather information, all those things into a system that can give you and you can benefit from machine learning. The 5 pillars, the strategy considers 5 pillars. It looks at preparedness, and that preparedness is all about ensuring that we can limit the impact of a disaster or a hazard. How do we do so at an individual level? How do we work with our households within the Caribbean community to ensure that their food safety is considered, that their food security is considered? So in the event of a disaster, our households storing sufficient water? Are they storing water in proper containers? If they have house gardens and kitchen gardens, are those kitchen gardens properly protected, etc.? What are the mechanisms that they can introduce at the individual household level to ensure that they are prepared? Are they storing sufficient food, dry food available just in case of a disaster? At an industry level, at a sectoral level, and at a national level. So at an industry, how is the crop industry being prepared? How is the livestock industry being prepared? How is this particular country, how is an OECS country being prepared, or how is one of the more developed countries preparing for a natural disaster? Then protection, ensuring that the critical infrastructure is protected and that there is no loss when such occur. So are the critical infrastructure, are they robust and strong? In a particular community, if 90% of that community's food comes from a particular location and there is a bridge that you have to cross within that space to bring the food out, is that bridge climate resilient? Can that infrastructure resist a disaster? If we're looking at protected agriculture using greenhouses, and a particular member state is within the path of hurricanes, are those systems, those greenhouses, hurricane resistant? Are they traditional greenhouses? So the emergency response strategy seeks to look at ensuring that the infrastructure is robust. It speaks to early warning. If you don't prepare, when many years ago when I was in university, the tutor often said that if you don't prepare, then prepare to fail. And I think that that is true within this space and in this conversation as we look at understanding disaster resilience, disaster building, disaster reduction within the agriculture sector. That if we don't prepare, if we don't ensure that we have a robust preparation for disasters, then in the event of a disaster, we have to expect that we would suffer great loss. And so the pillar, a fundamental pillar within the emergency response strategy is ensuring that there are early warning systems in place to prepare the country and to prepare the population, not to panic populations, but to prepare them. So if based on all the information that we can get in terms of forecasting and modeling, we can send early messages to farming populations, to household communities, then they will be able to activate their own household plans, their own industry plans to protect their lives, to protect their property, and also to accelerate what we call site-specific preparations. So you are involved in open farming and your animals are outside, but you do have a house prepared for them that is resilient and strong, and you receive early o'clock that there will be a disaster approaching, then you can bring them in. Or you have tomatoes that are about to be harvested and you plan to harvest it in 1 week, but you know a disaster is coming, then you can take the necessary precaution to harvest those tomatoes ahead of time and to put them in correct storage. Then it looks at emergency response. Emergency response, what happens in the event of a disaster? How do you respond? How do you coordinate a response if all the telephone lines are down and you cannot make contact locally? How will the region respond? That is included. And finally, recovery. Recovery is expensive. And so you have to look at what would be the first thing you do in your recovery. Then what is your second phase of recovery? And then rehabilitation. What are the efforts to restore? Which are the services you are going to restore first? During the time of COVID, we agreed that farmers, fisher folks, people involved in the food trade are essential workers. In the space of an emergency response strategy, that is the same kind of environment and mood that we want, where producers are considered essential services, that farmers, fisher folks, etc., they are essential, because in the absence of food, then we know what can happen. So the broad vision of the emergency response strategy is really to attack food security needs. How do we ensure that we preserve the food security needs of the region so that the most vulnerable, who are not in a position to stock up food for a month or 2 months, are still able to access food, because this is a human right? The vision of the emergency response strategy also speaks to disaster resilience. How do we build disaster resilience within the agricultural sector? And then finally, how do we ensure that the adequate capacity exists within member states, exists at a regional level, and exists amongst our developmental partners to respond with food emergency requirements in the event of a disaster? What is the outline? The outline, of course, speaks to the introduction, and it provides the policy environment, information on the policy environment. It provides information on the regional agriculture performance and outlook. So at least when a member state, when an individual, when a concerned citizen, when an investor, when anybody speaks of disaster, they understand from whence we are coming. We're coming from a position where the region imports a significant amount of food. Outside of a few member states, such as Belize and Guyana, most of our member states import over 50%, with at least 7 member states importing close to 80% of their food requirements. If that is the case, and we also have the Common Agricultural Policy then it means when we speak of disaster resilience within agriculture, we have to do it within the context that we are an net food importing region, and we need to be able to protect that. But additionally, there are some key crops that are produced in various member states. In Jamaica, they're producing quite a lot of ginger. Grenada is noted for not just nutmeg and cocoa, but now soursop. St Vincent, very strong in root crops. Antigua in pineapples. Guyana, extremely strong in rice. We have Belize in poultry, Belize as well in feed. So that is the policy environment. So the plan seeks to speak to that. It also seeks to establish what is called the baseline. What is the situational analysis? What is the current state of affairs as it relates to disaster trends? And my colleague from Dominica would have mentioned that Dominica is considered to be directly in the path of a lot of disasters. Bahamas is similar. If those are trends, St. Vincent in their presentation would have mentioned about the level, the intensity of the drought that they experience. And when we look at our weather maps, etc., we notice that the intensity of rainfall is becoming more. The duration sometimes might be shorter, but the whole weather patterns, those are changing. The plan seeks to map that. So at least we're starting from a position of data. In the absence of important data, in the absence of information, then the decision-making process cannot be evidence-based. And so the emergency response strategy seeks to articulate an evidence-based approach to decision-making. Then resilience building for the crops, livestock, forestry, and fisheries. Then section 3 seeks to outline what is called the strategy. What are the priority outcomes? It is no good to just have a document that we put on the shelf. The region, we ought to do, I think, better. And Dr. Justin Ram, in an article released earlier this year, indicated that based on our level of implementation, that if the Caribbean doesn't improve and increase its rate, can be and might be, and very well can find itself being amongst the poorest region by the time we get to 2050. It means that we need to be able to implement strategies, transformation initiatives faster, and to do so with the aid of information technology so that we can get better output and outcomes. The priority outcomes for the strategy hinges on 3 specific areas. Capacity building around the restoration of food production and livelihood systems. How do we ensure that our food systems are strengthened and that our food systems can be easily restored in the event of a natural disaster? And so our human resource capacity needs to be strengthened. But it also speaks to a community approach. Very, very often, the local community, they know, and by history and by tradition, they know of the challenges that they've been faced with. They know exactly where floods. They understand what is called the terrain of the lay of the land. The emergency response strategy seeks to hone in on the knowledge and experiences of our communities to ensure that the disaster resilience capacity at the community level is strengthened. And then, of course, it speaks to our plant, animal health, and food safety measures. How do we ensure that our food safety is strong, that our plant and animal health systems are strong to protect lives and to protect livelihoods in the event of a disaster? Then we have what is called the strategic priorities. And those strategic priorities seeks to the establishment of a platform for sustaining the strategy and actions, because it is a regional in its approach. How do we bring all these different institutions together in a regional mechanism to make sure that the plans can be implemented, that the action plans can be implemented, that the specific initiatives to prepare for a disaster are undertaken, that the response mechanisms are captured, and that we can recover and rehabilitate in the event of a disaster. It also seeks to enhance the capacity for comprehensive disaster risk management. Within our jurisdictions and member states, how do we ensure that the capacity exists to tap into donor resources, to tap into multilateral banks, to tap into our own local jurisdiction to build disaster risk measures? It looks at national and regional financial capacities, and it also looks at the institutional and technical capacities for emergency response, and again, specific to the agriculture sector. Section 4 speaks to implementation and governance. And as I've said before, implementation is one of the fundamental aspects of the plan. A very good plan, poor implementation, then the growth and development of the region's agricultural sector, and by extension, its socio-economic development, can be retarded if we do not have very strong, robust, and aggressive implementation. So a coordination plan exists that brings all the stakeholders together, but also the triggering mechanism. What is it that is going to trigger a particular response or particular intervention by the various regional partners? A communication plan. Very often good things are done, not communicated, but how do we communicate before? How do we bring the communities along with us? How do we bring the rural communities along with us? Are we going to send a 20-page document in a rural village, or will we have specific small video clippings, a community approach that can take the what can be the university graduate, but can also take the ordinary citizen along the path of ensuring that at the household level, the disaster resilience is enhanced. Monitoring and evaluation. If we don't measure, we cannot assess progress. We cannot take corrective actions. And so a key aspect of implementation is being able to monitor, evaluate, but most importantly, to be able to report on progress, to report on the priority outcomes, so that the citizens of the region can be taken along the journey, but that they can also hold us public servants accountable for the things and the commitments that we've made. Data and information management, very critical to have those. How do we capture data? How do we process those data? And how do we then use that data, disseminate it for evidence-based decision-making? Big fight over data internationally. If you don't have it, then you are at the mercies of those who have those data. We want to be able to put the region in a space where data is available to us. We know how to use it, but also how do we secure it for the maintenance of livelihoods? And then finally, the financing and resource management aspect of the plan is important. How do we raise the resources to build resilience, but also how do we ensure that after we've raised them, that it is spent in a manner that is going to give the greatest bang for the buck? Wrapping up, in terms of the purpose of the action plan, it provides guidelines for coordinating at a regional and international level. It defines roles and responsibilities, and it assesses the damage and loss, and then mobilize and coordinate assistance. So we have guidelines as to how we're going to go about. We have roles clearly defined and responsibilities clearly articulated and aligned. We have mechanisms or tools in place through what is called the functional annexes that would allow us to do proper damage and loss assessment. If a disaster occurs and we are unable to properly do an assessment, then we cannot quantify the damage, and then it's going to be difficult to be able to build robust recovery and rehabilitation programs. It's not going to be the most efficient way of allocating social security support through the social safety nets without proper damage and loss assessments. So the plan consists of functional annexes that allows us to do specific damage and loss based on the sector. Crops damage and loss assessment is going to be different from livestock. So too fisheries will be different from forestry, and then mobilize and coordinate assistance. The phases of the action plan, I've mentioned it numerous times. Preparedness, phase 1. Emergency response, phase 2. Recovery and rehabilitation, phase 3. In conclusion, there can be no denying of the threat to regional agriculture from natural and other disasters. We have hurricanes, we have dry weather patterns, we have intense rainfalls, we have the COVID-19 pandemic as 4 tangible experiences that suggest to us that we face a number of threats, that the region is considered to be amongst the most vulnerable small island developing states. or most vulnerable nations in the world. So that is a given. It means that if such vulnerability exists, how do we coordinate in an intersectoral way? How do we design and advocate for the building of resilience within the sector, even if it's just to ensure that our food security is maintained, that the nutritional adequacy of our population is enhanced? How do we do that? The method and the mechanism that the region has approved that is going to be used to assist member states in their own resilience building is through the emergency response strategy and action plan. And that is now being currently, it's already designed, written, I must say. It is now being graphically designed and it's getting ready to be printed and disseminated throughout the region. Colleagues, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edwards, for running us through the contents of the plan. Indeed, it's very important that we make sure that everything is coordinated, especially when we are confronted with multiple hazards or threats, and we have this tendency to actually get lost into the details and forget things that are actually quite important as we rush to implement our response actions. So now I turn over the floor to my colleague Martina to wrap up this side event. Over to you, Martina.
Thank you, Roberto. Well, we are supposed to be having a question and answer session now, but I'm not seeing any questions on the YouTube channel chat. So I will just take the opportunity now to say thank you to all of our distinguished presenters this afternoon. I mean, you did an excellent job sharing with us all the experiences that you've had, the challenges that you're having in your countries, and how you're dealing with them at the community level, at the national level, also at the regional level. So thank you very much for sharing with us this afternoon. I also want to thank our viewers for sticking with us, even though we're beyond time. And I also want to give a special thank you to my colleague Roberto for co-facilitating the session this afternoon. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good evening. Thank you.